This presentation was recorded on the Accio AK60 microphone for podcasts, recording, and streaming. In addition to the latest and most technologically advanced recording and broadcast equipment, check out their website at accio.net for more information. The Pied Piper of Tucson led a debauched life to the point where he mesmerized those around him into thinking that he was the epitome of 1960s cool. But behind the facade, there existed one of the most ruthless killers in American crime history. For years, one particular inmate strutted through the corridors of the Arizona State Penitentiary with an air as though he did not belong, even though within his heart existed the core of a true, brutal murderer of young girls. When the inmate turned the corner of the corridor in which he walked one day, several other inmates appeared who suffered through his denegrations and began stabbing the inmate with a vicious abandon. The elitist inmate laid on the floor of the corridor, his life force running unabated onto the prison floor. Although badly wounded, the wounded inmate suffered damage to his kidneys and other internal organs. Surgeons worked feverishly to save his life, but with a sucking chest wound in the right chest that seemed to not respond to any medical attention, damage to his right eye that was so bad that surgeons determined it had to be removed. At the final count, the wounded inmate suffered close to 20 stab wounds. He lingered for 10 days hanging on to life and then finally succumbed. Incidents such as these occur all over the nation every day, with dozens of inmates being shivved for one reason or another. It has been part of the prison culture since time immemorial, but this particular murdered inmate portrayed himself as somewhat above the law and better than the inmates in which he shared his residence. Charles Schmid, the dead inmate, certainly deserved the incarceration he experienced, and some say cheated the executioner when the inmates took justice into their own hands. Charles Howard Smitty Schmid was born on July 8, 1942, as an illegitimate child and later adopted by Charles and Catherine Schmid, operators of a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. Young Charles found it hard to get along with his father, especially after the divorce of his adopted parents. When the young man wanted to go and see his mother, his adopted father said that if the young man wanted to do so, he would not be welcomed upon his return. Schmid did not do well in school, but most considered him to be handsome, well-mannered, and intelligent. Athletic as well, Schmid led his high school gymnastics team to a state championship, but later quit the team in his senior year. During his last year of high school, Schmid stole some goods from the machine shop and was later suspended. When the suspension ended, he never returned to the institution. He lived in his quarters on his parents' property and received an allowance of $300 per month. The only thing that Smitty, what his friends now called him, occupied himself with drinking, picking up girls, and not working. He had the run of the property and of Tucson because his parents bought him a motorcycle and a car. Although considered handsome, Smitty stood very short and wore cowboy boots stuffed with newspaper and flattened aluminum cans. Smitty also wore pancake makeup, lip balm, and fashioned a fake mole on his cheek. Schmid also used a clothespin to stretch his lip far enough to resemble Elvis Presley. The young man became known as the Pied Piper due to his popularity with the teenage community of Tucson, Arizona. People considered the strange young man somewhat charismatic and frequently met him at a place known as the Speedway. This close-knit group would prove useful to Schmid in the future as they remained silent for a time surrounding the tragic events in the future. Even though Schmid gained quite a following with his charisma, he soon became bored with the just ho-hum existence he fashioned for himself within the last few years after leaving high school. Schmid's girlfriend at the time, Mary French, kept the young man occupied, but he exhibited a boredom that only an horrific incident could jar. On May 31, 1964, Schmid and his girlfriend French asked another friend, Alleen Rowe, a sophomore at Palo Verde living with her divorced mother, to go out with a friend of Schmid's, John Sanders. Alleen loved to walk in the desert, one of her favorite pastimes since her mother moved to Tucson after her divorce with Alleen and her other children. Alleen hoped one day to be an oceanographer and loved the heat of the desert because she said it made her feel alive. For some reason, even though Schmid had a girlfriend, he zeroed in on Alleen. Several times during the day of May 31st, he called French in order for her to go out with the group, including his friend, John Saunders. Schmid harangued French so much during the day that she finally relented and approached the young sophomore. Alleen stated that she could not go out that evening because she had an exam at school the next day that she had to study for. When Schmid arrived at French's house, he seemed jittery and anxious for Alleen to go with him, Saunders, and French. French recognized Schmid's anxiety and then proceeded to find Alleen at a friend's house where the young girl had been visiting that day. Finally, Alleen relented and decided to go with the trio. Later that evening, the three drove around until they could ascertain whether Aileen's mother was still awake. Finally, they stopped in front of the teenager's house and French went and knocked on Aileen's window. The young girl came outside with her curlers in her hair, wearing a bathing suit. Alleen got into the back seat with Saunders, and then the group took off in the car with Schmid driving. Schmid drove the vehicle to a secluded part in the desert when the four got out of the car. Schmid liked to take his lady friends to this particular area where they would drink and make out. The Wash, or a dry creek bed that only floods periodically. Schmid and French went to a wash some distance away from the car, and when Schmid told his girlfriend to go back to the car and grab a radio, he heard Alleen scream. When Schmid and French returned to the vehicle, they found Saunders struggling to gain control of the teenager. Schmid yelled out that Saunders needed to cover her mouth to muffle the screaming. Schmid then bound Aileen's arms behind her back with some guitar cord and then instructed Saunders to remove her bathing suit. The whole time during this struggle, Alleen wanted to know what they planned to do with her. Saunders and Schmid led the girl back to the wash where Schmid had previously occupied with French. Schmid ordered Saunders to remove the girl's bathing suit, but he had trouble removing it due to her arms being tied. Schmid removed the binding. Alleen was then forced to lie on the ground, and Schmid told Saunders to go ahead. When Saunders had too much trouble with the girl due to her crying, Schmid told him to take a walk. A few minutes later, Saunders heard Schmid calling from the spot where Alleen laid. When he arrived just a few short moments later, Alleen was on the ground trying to put her bathing suit back on. When she finally arose from the ground, Alleen walked into the wash followed by the two young men. Just then, walking behind her, Schmid picked up a pointed rock and handed it to Saunders. It appeared that to kill Alleen had been the plan all along, and Saunders could not go through with it. Saunders handed the rock back to Schmid, who instructed the other young man to go back to the car. When Saunders returned to the car, he found French there unable to move for some reason. French refused to return anywhere with Saunders to look for Schmid. Saunders then went back to the area where he left his friend, and when he arrived, he witnessed Alleen on the ground, her head bloodied and Schmid covered in blood. Schmid wanted to know where French was at the time. When the two returned to the car, Schmid admitted to his girlfriend that, "We killed her. I love you very much." Schmid seemed on the verge of ecstasy, and he reported to French what he had just done. Schmid stated to his girlfriend that Saunders struck the fatal blow and not he. French and Schmid went back to the scene with the shovel from the trunk of the car, and French noticed Alleen dead. The three then began digging a shallow grave, which they then deposited Aileen's body and covered her with sand, tossing the sand over her hairy curlers. Schmid then used the shovel to bury his blood-stained shirt along with Aileen's body. After making sure they disposed of any evidence at the burial site, Schmid, French, and Saunders returned to the car, wiping away any fingerprints. The three then concocted a story where they stated that Alleen agreed to go out with Saunders that evening, but when they arrived at her residence to pick her up, she was not at home. So, they drove French home, and Schmid and Saunders returned to their quarters that they shared. The following day, Norma Rowe, Aleen's mother, went to the police to report her daughter missing. She stated that when she left the house that night to go to work, she works as a nurse, Alleen was in her bed asleep, but when she returned home that morning, her daughter appeared missing. Mrs. Rowe noted that Alleen took no other articles of clothing nor her purse. The girl's distraught mother related to police that Alleen mentioned to her about a sex club at the local high school where students engaged in drugs, perversions, and even prostitution. When the officer heard Mrs. Rowe's claim, he believed it to be the most outlandish accusation he had ever heard and stated that there had been no reports of such activity. Police questioned Schmid, French, and Saunders, but no information could be gleaned from the three. Prior to the questioning, though, Schmid conversed with the other two at length to make sure that they told the same story to authorities. A week after Aleen's disappearance, Norma Rowe received a very bizarre telephone call from her ex-husband, Aleen's father. He stated to the distraught mother he had a dream that their daughter had been abducted and then taken to the desert where someone murdered her. Mrs. Rowe believed her ex-husband's premonition and nagged the police to do something about her daughter's disappearance. But the authorities insisted they needed more concrete evidence before they instituted a search for her daughter in such a large area of the Arizona desert. As time passed, Norma Rowe alerted the FBI, the media, and the Arizona State's Attorney General's office, despite the fact that authorities averred that Alleen was merely a runaway. Norma Rowe even consulted a psychic to help locate her daughter. Aleen's case soon lost any traction with both the police and the media. Soon thereafter, John Saunders left the area to join the U.S. Navy. A man named Richie Bruns stepped into his place as Schmid's best friend. Bruns decided to emulate Schmid in the way he dressed because he considered his closest new friend to be extremely trendy. After all, Richie noted that his last 4 girlfriends broke up with him because of his social ineptness. When Schmid even mentioned the murder of Alleen Rowe, Richie believed it was just another story that his friend told to gain some more popularity. One day, while Schmid loitered around a pool in Speedway, he noticed a young 16-year-old girl named Gretchen Fritz. Gretchen appeared to Schmid exactly the way he liked his females, somewhat thin and blonde. When other young men informed Schmid that she meant nothing but trouble, Schmid became even more enthralled with the young girl. Schmid followed the young girl home one day and noticed that she lived in a mansion located in a wealthy neighborhood. Schmid later discovered that her father was a successful thoracic surgeon, and Gretchen was considered to be the oddball of the family. She once told a friend that she admired prostitutes because they charged boys for what the boys believed they should get for free. Others that knew the young girl characterized her as a pathological liar and recommended psychiatric treatment for the teen. Another friend believed her to be psychotically jealous. Schmid formulated a plan to meet the young girl when he carried a box full of pots and pans, pretending to be a traveling salesman to her front door. After telling her that he just pretended to be selling pots and pans as a way to meet her, Gretchen invited Schmid into her house for a drink. Schmid became aroused at the thought and accepted the invitation. This became what would be commonly known in present-day terms as a fatal attraction. As the two got to know each other, Gretchen related that her family hated her. Her brother-in-law happened to be a member of the mafia, and that she was pregnant. Schmid and Gretchen then had sex. She thought the playboy would leave her, but instead he said he loved her. Gretchen and Schmid started showing outward signs of being a couple. Schmid had a reputation for giving girls cheap engagement rings and promised to marry each and every one of them, only to have them work and put the money in his account. Gretchen and Schmid often had arguments about the other girls that the wily murderer was seeing at the time. She did not get along with Schmid's new best friend, Bruns, either. Bruns often questioned why Schmid let this girl get under his skin, so to speak. Schmid informed his friends that she knew the same secret as Richie, that he murdered Alleen Rowe. Several times Schmid tried to break up with Gretchen, but he claimed she stole his diary and knew all of his dark secrets, including but not limited to the murder of a young boy that Schmid had buried in the desert. Schmid claimed Gretchen held all of this over his head, and he exhibited a fear that if he ended the relationship, she would turn him in to authorities. When Gretchen went out of town one weekend with her family, Schmid decided to have a series of wild parties. Suddenly, Gretchen showed up and confronted Schmid about one of his many engagements. To add insult to injury, Mary French appeared at one of the parties as well and demanded that Schmid marry her because she was pregnant with his baby. Gretchen then stated she was pregnant as well. She suggested that the two run off together, but when Schmid decided the plan unfeasible, Gretchen stormed off calling Schmid a rat. On the evening of August 16, 1965, Gretchen and her younger sister Wendy went to the movies to see the Elvis Presley flick Tickle Me. The young girls did not return home. Dr. Fritz, the girls' father, hired a private detective, William Helig, to find his children and discovered that Gretchen's red and white Pontiac Le Mans was parked behind the Flamingo Hotel near the Speedway. When the authorities examined the car, they noted that the front and back seats contained gravel and mud, with the odometer registering an extra 60 miles. Police then found Gretchen's purse, ticket stubs from a movie theater, her keys, and a business card for a failed upholstery company that Schmid started some time ago. When they tried to find any witnesses as to how the car became parked behind the hotel, the police could find no one. A witness later came forward and placed the two girls at the Cactus Drive-In. The police then received a report that the two girls had been spotted hitchhiking to Nogales when a car picked them up and drove in a southerly direction. Several witnesses from across the border stated that they spotted the two girls on a bus to Hermosillo. The authorities combed the interior of Mexico looking for the girls, following every lead, no matter where, but soon gave up and considered the two girls to be runaways. Both Bruns and Schmid endured endless questioning surrounding the disappearance of the two girls through the auspices of William Helig. Helig believed Schmid knew more of the disappearances that he let on at the time. After Helig's questioning, Schmid sat down and initially informed Bruns that the girls drove off in the car to run away. Bruns thought he remembered Gretchen's car passing by his house at a high rate of speed the night they allegedly disappeared. Bruns thought to himself that he was glad that Gretchen was gone, no more trouble with her. Schmid calmly stated to Bruns that he thought his friend knew what happened to Gretchen, and Bruns continued to deny any knowledge. It became readily apparent to Bruns that Schmid essentially confessed to murdering both girls right there in the bungalow the two men shared. After all, over the course of their friendship, and even the time that Bruns had known Schmid, tall tales abounded as members of their small group tried to outbad each other with yarns of meanness and defiance. But this time, Bruns knew that Schmid was serious. The murderer confessed that he strangled both young girls and put their bodies into the trunk of the car, driving to an obvious place because Schmid began to exhibit a don't-care attitude toward murdering young women. He stated to Bruns that it seemed to get easier and easier every time. Bruns became very unsettled with what he heard and wondered whether he, too, may become a victim of this psychopath. A visit by some other local hoodlums convinced Bruns that he needed to distance himself from Schmid as soon as he could. The two men from a group calling themselves the Tucson Mafia arrived at the apartment of the two men and pressured Schmid and Bruns to tell them the whereabouts of the Fritz sisters. Schmid told the detectives investigating the case that he believed the girls ran off to San Diego, so the men of the Mafia thought he wouldn't mind going with them to look for her. The men advised Schmid to get ready, and they picked him up later that day. Before they hit the highway headed to California, they took Schmid to see a man named Charles Batts Battaglia. The men then expressed an interest in questioning Bruns about the girls, and the young man began to panic as he thought they had found the bodies. The two men were returned to their abode unharmed, and immediately called another friend and informed him about the mysterious visit. Paul Graff, the friend, instructed the two to call the FBI, which, strangely, Schmid had done. Unable to reach anyone on the telephone, Schmid then suggested to Bruns that they bury the bodies where no one could find them. At first, Bruns did not take Schmid seriously, but the two soon traveled to a former secluded drinking spot. When they arrived in the area, Schmid got out of the car and got a shovel from the trunk. He walked a short distance away and then called Bruns to his location. When Bruns looked down, he saw a black form that appeared to be lying in a shallow grave. He smelled the stench and realized that he was looking at a dead body that had decomposed for quite some time. These were the remains of Gretchen Fritz. Schmid then knelt down near the remains while Bruns dug another shallow hole. In placing the body in the original spot, Schmid tied Gretchen's legs together with a rag. A short distance away lay the body of Wendy Fritz. The two young men dragged Gretchen's body further down the wash and placed her in the newly dug hole, leaving Wendy's remains where they were. Schmid then instructed Bruns to wipe off Gretchen's tennis shoes of all fingerprints, then removed one of the shoes and threw it into the desert. Schmid then reminded Bruns that he was deeply involved in it now, as deep as Schmid. On the following day, Schmid learned that the FBI paid a visit to his parents' home and then left. Also on this day, Schmid received another visit from the Tucson Mafia, who then took him to San Diego, where they searched for a young man that Gretchen stated she may have had a meeting with at the time of her disappearance. Schmid took photos of Gretchen and showed them to people meandering the beach there, knowing full well that he knew the exact location of both of the young girls because he murdered and placed them there. Later, Schmid had been arrested for impersonating an FBI agent, but his mother managed to secure his release. At this point, Bruns suspected that Schmid may try and eliminate former girlfriends. Bruns developed a crush on one of Schmid's old flames, Darlene Kirk, so he began patrolling around her residence so that he would be able to protect her from Schmid should the need arise. Bruns even attempted to hide in Kirk's garbage cans, all in an effort to protect Darlene. Her father even threatened to shoot him with an air rifle, but Bruns told the old man to go ahead and shoot him and end his suffering. Schmid's affections then turned next to a 15-year-old girl named Diane Lynch. Described as all but 87 pounds, Schmid became smitten and asked the teenager to marry him. This they did on October 24, 1965, in Nogales, Mexico. At the time of their marriage, Bruns expressed disbelief that Schmid could just forget about the murdered girls, as Bruns' guilt festered to where he felt he needed to provide for Darlene's safety. Bruns' overprotection resulted in his arrest for making threats. He went to live in Ohio with his grandmother, and there, after several days, confessed to his relatives everything he knew about the disappearances and deaths of the Fritz sisters. When notified, the Tucson police flew Bruns back to the area to identify where Schmid buried the bodies. When they began digging, they found the skeletal remains of Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. The police now turned their attention toward Schmid. On November 10, 1965, Schmid worked in his front yard and noticed an unmarked car parked near his house. He thought that the Tucson Mafia were making another sojourn to question him. When he returned to go inside, police followed Schmid into the house and arrested him. As the police handcuffed him and dragged him through the front door, Schmid called out to his 15-year-old wife, Diane, pleading with her to get in touch with his mother, Catherine Schmid, stating that she would take care of the situation. When the officers arrived at the station with Schmid, they played Bruns' taped confession. When Schmid refused to talk, they brought Bruns into the interrogation room in the hopes that Schmid would confess. All the two men did was stare at each other when Schmid said, "I know why you're doing this." Schmid stated he was innocent and would prove it at trial. After leaving the interrogation room, authorities booked Charles Howard Schmid with the murders of Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. When asked to remove his cowboy boots, Schmid reluctantly agreed. The amount of material that spewed from the boots filled 2 shoeboxes. Rags, and crushed cans that he placed in the footwear to make him appear taller. With Schmid behind bars held without bail, authorities acquired a search warrant for his residence. One officer flew to Connecticut to pick up John Saunders, and another flew to Texas to pick up Mary French. After the officer informed Mary French that Schmid had married, she gave a detailed statement as to the events as they occurred on the night of May 31st, 1964. Saunders also confessed, but maintained that Schmid actually committed the murder of Alleen Rowe. When law enforcement brought French and Saunders to the area where they claimed Schmid buried the bodies, neither could identify the exact spot where Alleen was buried. But they did manage to find two rusty curlers that Norma Rowe identified as having belonged to her daughter. A large search of the area ensued, but because of a hurricane that engulfed the area in September of 1964, Sheriff Walden Vivian Burr surmised that the bones may have been washed away. County Attorney Norman Green stated that he would try Schmid with or without a body. At a preliminary hearing, Saunders pled guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence, eligible for parole within 7 years. Mary French pled guilty to some lesser charges and would be eligible for parole in 4 to 5 years. Both of the convicts would testify against Schmid for the state. On February 15, 1966, the court determined that Schmid would stand trial for the murders of Gretchen and Wendy Fritz, and on March 15, 1966, for the murder of Alleen Rowe. At the first trial, the prosecution, under the leadership of William Schaefer III, brought forth over 30 witnesses to testify. After the testimony, both sides rested. On March 1, 1966, the jury deliberated for 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty against Charles Howard Smitty Schmid for the murders of Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. They adjudicated the penalty he should suffer would be death. Schmid still had to endure another trial in the death of Alleen Rowe. Schmid and his defense team believed that they may be able to get the famous attorney F. Lee Bailey involved, but after some preliminary truth investigations, the defense could not afford Bailey as their counsel. Then in July of 1966, Diane divorced her husband of 18 months. In order to save Schmid's life, the state offered a deal that if he pled guilty to second-degree murder in all of the murders, even though 2 of them had already been adjudicated, he would be sentenced to life imprisonment. Reluctantly, Schmid agreed to the adjusted sentence and eventually led the prosecutors to the location of Rowe's body. Charles Schmid died of his wounds sustained by an inmate attack. His parents refused to bring his body home for burial and instead okayed the internment of his remains in the prison cemetery. The Pied Piper of Tucson incites questions as to how someone so vain and evil could have attracted the affections of numerous women, drawing 2 of them into his web close enough to brutally murder them, along with Wendy Fritz. I guess when we examine cases where serial killers attract female admirers to their domain, then we would be able to answer that question. We here at the True Crime Man's Dark Imagination YouTube channel believe it has something to do with the continued manipulation that the killers exude. In any case, it was almost certainly the deadly wiles of Charles Howard Schmid Jr. that caused the deaths of 3 beautiful, vivacious young girls who just fell into the wrong world. Until next time.